Great. We have started recording, therefore. Yeah.
Well, it's 3 minutes past, so we could just start, couldn't we? And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this, the first in a series of seminars delivered by several fellows of the Knapp Foundation, where the broader scope of our work, which we both undertake and support through our various research streams, will be exhibited. At the same time, these seminars will demonstrate that our research streams were not merely chosen arbitrarily, but rather were brought into relief and shaped by the question, the fundamental question that grounds the Knapp Foundation, the question of truth itself. The development of the foundation has always and will always be guided by the pursuit of this question, or perhaps the questioning of this question. And so these seminars address how we do what we say we do on our website. That is, how do we open up paths for inquiries into truth? And so who better to kick off proceedings than the founder and the director of the Knapp Foundation, Professor Laurence Hemming. Beyond the foundation, Laurence is an honorary professor in Lancaster University's Philosophy, Politics and Religion Department and the Management School there. He has published a number of books and translations, including Heidegger's Atheism, Postmodernity's Transcending, and Heidegger and Marx, A Productive Dialogue over the Language of Humanism. He also edited and co-translated Ernst Jünger's 1932 work, Die Arbeiter, the Worker. Laurence is currently working on a monograph that asks why a single fragment of very early Greek love poetry contains all of the most important words also found in what is widely accepted as one of the earliest fragments of philosophy, the so-called Anaximander fragment, and what this means for our thoughts of love today. This evening, Laurence's presentation is titled The Unfolding Political. Over to you, Laurence.
Aaron, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Any of you who have turned up this evening expecting, as it were, the solution to the world's political problems are going to be very disappointed. I intend to do actually quite the reverse. One of the questions that has beset us in a lot of our conversations within the foundation over the last few years is the question of the character of the political as such, how we understand the dimension of the political, if you want to call it that. And I've been asked to, the ideas that I want to address, the purpose of these seminars is for people to present their current research. And I've been asked to make available, as it were, some of some thoughts on what I'm currently working on. And it is this question that has gnawed away at me for some years, which is, how does the dimension of the political arise, both historically in discourse and as a philosophical question at all? I want to begin by saying that, I mentioned that some years ago, Peter Lilly, who is a good friend to the foundation, and I were in a discussion, and I started to quote Hegel, and he got quite impatient with me in a generous way. I wouldn't. This is in no sense critical of him, in no sense meant to be critical of him, but ticked me off in the company in which we were for spending too much time talking about, as he put it, windy Germans. There is a sense in which the people I'm going to refer to today are all windy Germans, and there is, I believe, a reason for that. It's been odd to me, although I've worked with German thought most of my life, the extent to which the concerns and considerations of the foundation have circulated around German thought. Something I discussed with Professor Magnus Ryan from Cambridge, who is one of our advisors, who is a sort of Germanist Monkey, as it were, because he has had a similar experience. The Germans have an understanding of some questions, and those questions arose for them in ways that they have not and did not arise in British intellectual life, or if they did so in a dependent sense. And when Aaron Turner held his conference on Altertumswissenschaft, which is not at all, of course, a German word, in February, it was very settling to me to hear Glenn Most make a vigorous defense of the extent to which the ideas around how we study history in the modern sense itself were entirely developed in the German context. Indeed, Glenn went through a list of all the countries that sent students to German universities in order to understand how to think about history in the late 18th century. There are two texts that lie behind what I want to talk about today. One of them is not very well known at all, and one is far better known, although not often widely read. The first is Kant's idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan aim. It was published in 1784 after the publication of the first critique. And then the second text is Hegel's philosophy of history. These two texts take, as it were, the metaphysical thoughts of both thinkers and try to give them a universal, if contemporary, but nevertheless both political and historical construction. They stand in very stark contrast to the thinking that you would find, for instance, in France, that arises from Rousseau and from Voltaire and from Montaigne, and from that tradition of thinking, as it were, of primitivity as a pristine world, or in Britain, where, and David McGrogan, I know, is focusing on this question very much at the moment with Thomas Hobbes. We reflect on how civilization and the state is an alternative to the nastiness, brutishness, and shortness of human life. Both Kant and Hegel posit, and I use the term very carefully, they place before us an ideal for the globe as a whole in such a way that it's possible to think of the globe as a whole, almost for the first time in that period, as, if you like, a cosmopolitan bürgerliche in German, a cosmopolitan, or we might even say bourgeois entity, one which has as its pinnacle, well, in Hegel's case, certainly, the ideal of Prussian Protestant metaphysics as what would hold it together. It is Aristotle who defines the human being, the anthropos, as zoion politikon, the political living being. It is this living being as such that he says is logon echon, the being that has and is held by language. How is the politikos, the political, as it were, or the one who is in the political, here to be understood? From where does it come, or how is it to be derived? I want to make really only one point tonight, because I don't have very long, and I know Aaron is watching the clock already and will cut me off if I go on too long. And so if I can, I want to succeed in making this point as succinctly as possible. Modern political life has been, for a long time, been understood through the form of subjectivity. Nowhere is this clearer than in the work of Hegel. Few people still attend to Hegel, and yet in Hegel's description of the construction and emergence of the subjectivity of the subject in his 1805-06 Jena lectures on subjective spirit, we immediately recognize something thoroughly contemporary. Now, the reason I've chosen this little text is twofold. One is, I think it's one of the clearest statements in German idealism that lays out how subjectivity is constructed. But the other is that Hegel accomplishes something in it, and he follows the contours of Kant's first critique, and in particular the first edition of the first critique, so closely that it's almost impossible to think that it wasn't open on the desk as he prepared the lecture. These lectures formed the basis for what became the phenomenology of Geist, or the phenomenology of spirit, initially conceived as a cardinal point of Hegel's system, and later in the course of the development of his logic was only later, therefore, relegated to a much less important place. Nevertheless, the phenomenology of spirit, even though much misunderstood, continues to dominate what reading of Hegel there still is. Now, Hegel works out his understanding of subjectivity in relation to Kant, Fichte, and Schelling. And although he modifies what he finds in them, he takes over, especially from Kant, the essential structure of the metaphysics of subjectivity that he finds already laid out there in principle. What has followed, even in the Anglophone world, in the wake of the collapse of Hegel's system, remains, I would like to suggest, entirely in the thrall of what he lays out. The inevitability of progress, the end of history, that history, as it were, has an end, both a purpose and a fulfillment, the bureaucratization of race, for instance, and the current obsessions with so-called identity, the confrontation with technology, all of these unfold within the province of thought that we could point to and call Hegel's metaphysics. Now, does this mean that each of these areas that I've named, or that we even ourselves think as Hegel thought? No, I don't mean this at all. I mean almost the opposite, that we unthinkingly take for granted as an already given, as a self-evidence, what Hegel puts in place, from which unthought place our own thinking, such that it is self-evidently and so unquestioningly takes off. In political life, we now routinely take it for granted that what is not named is somehow also present. A lot of Twitter works like this. If you name something in a certain region of thinking, you can often be criticized, as it were, for not naming what is also negatively implied in the naming of that which is named. It is Hegel's metaphysics which explains statements like the following, and I quote, "Materiality is itself produced by and in direct relation to the investment of power." Or, another quote, "That matter is always materialized has, I think, to be thought in relation to the productive and indeed materializing effects of regulatory power in the Foucaultian sense." Those two quotes are from Judith Butler, as it were, the bête noire of many thinkers in the present period. Much of what Butler says, which we could take metaphysically, is quite outrageous. And yet, I want to argue, it flows from things that are left over from things that Hegel and Kant said. They are echoes. What she says is often an echo of what we can find in Kant and Hegel. Now, we could preoccupy ourselves at great length with the intricacies of Hegel's system. Here comes the windy bit. But you may be relieved, I do not think we need to do so. I wish to illustrate only that aspect of Hegel's subjective thought, which is determinative for what I am calling the unfolding of the political. So Hegel begins the lectures on subjective Geist by saying, and I quote, "The existence of the object, its space, is in spirit being. It is the abstract, pure concept of existence." The object in question, the object that Hegel names, is twofold. First, he says it is the thing, and then he says it is the I. But second, it is these as realizing the universal, this thing he calls being, in itself. The I is the universal, but only initially in its most negative form. It is this as particular, inasmuch as the I must realize the universality that it will become. Everything that follows works to show how this is something that is compelled. Compelled here we may take as the unfolding of my title, the unfolding of the political. Being here is the universal, which is to be realized through the compulsion of the I. The I, my I, who I am, therefore, is in some way compelled to behave in certain ways. This compulsion is in fact the establishing of the subject itself. This is what is often overlooked in Hegel's thought. The particular is always for him an effect of the universal, and not the other way around. Or the universal is not what he calls being, and cannot therefore be realized. Hegel discusses this unfolding a little later when he discusses the activity of the will. The will, he says, satisfies itself through the drive, not, as several authors, including Butler, have tried to claim, desire. But rather, Hegel says, the universal is, through the drive, locked together with the particular. What he means by this is that fulfilling the compulsion that the I experiences to act is the exercise of the freedom of the I, but directed in particular ways. What we must consider, Hegel says, is how the knowing of one present, eine Sehende, he says, will itself be a movement of spirit itself, such that the universal will be fulfilled as the postulation and accomplishment of what I have called here the political. And Hegel has already jumped ahead of us to call being. This movement will make spirit universal for the spatially located being, the I, the thing. Now, in just a few short paragraphs, Hegel accomplishes everything preparatory to the unfolding of the political itself, namely how the individual subject, the knowing being, experiences what unfolds as a compulsion, which nevertheless is also a freedom, namely what he calls the freedom of time, within which the postulate of the subject appears for itself through the representational power of the imagination in general. Elsewhere, Hegel calls this the producing imagination, which is the accomplishment of a self over against itself. This self over against itself is a reduplication, a bending back of the self upon itself, what several authors have called recognition, or a word that we find in Kant which explains it even better, reflexion. This reflexion, this bending of the self back over the self, creates an interior space, a space of the within, as it were, the within which Kant, for instance, wanted to account for the place of what was perceived in accounts of thinkers such as Hume, with whom he was, at least to a degree, in confrontation, or of Locke, or of Leibniz. This is the space, therefore, not of the object, the Gegenstand, but of the I, the self, who is the subject. But this being bent back over the self is consciousness, and this is the locus of unfolding spirit. Now, before we make a certain leap, there is one for Hegel essential step that must be understood. For as the emergent subject consciousness unfolds, it moves from taking being as mine to being challenged by everything that it is not, or rather that is not mine. This is the relic of the thought of Fichte in Hegel's thought. Hegel describes this in quite extraordinary terms. He calls this the night itself. He says, man is this night. Man taken here in the inclusive sense, humanity as a whole. Man is this night, this empty nothing, which contains everything in its simplicity, an infinite wealth of manifold representations. This is the not I that the I already is. Again, the reference to Fichte is inescapable, but the primary reference is not to Fichte at all, but to Aristotle. The soul is in some sense the entirety of all that is. This is what Hegel has in mind. It is in a sense also what Fichte has in mind when he defines the I over against what is not I. The actual particular subject is an intuited present space and time, and still negatively already an absolute subject. And so it is the unity of the present with being the universal itself. There follows then, in a sequence in this lecture, whose full working out we do not have time to consider, the emergence of the transformations of the subject, first as realizing spirit through a continual upbuilding, a labor or work, which is at the same time the fulfillment of the compulsion I have named as the achievement of a will. This will lead to the subject falling in love, establishing a family, having children, participating in civil society, sharing in the construction of the state. In other words, establishing the sphere of the political. In each case, these things are positings of the will, that compulsion that I named earlier. And this is explained by Hegel in its most developed form in his philosophy of right. It is to the state that I want to turn, simply because we don't have time to colour in everything that goes in between. The state, then, is the full actualization of the unfolding of the political. The state is an unfolding in which the construct of the political appears in its most concrete form, the political as unfolded, but as unfolded as posited. How else does Hegel describe this? In 1833, Edvard Gans added a comment or an addition to a section of the philosophy of right, which says this, which he claimed was Hegel quoting. It was a quote from Hegel, but it was clearly something that Gans added, and it goes like this: the state is spirit itself, which exists in the world and realizes itself as such through consciousness. It is the path of God through the world, the force of reason actualizing itself as will. Now, the American philosopher Walter Kaufmann, in his commentary on Hegel's political philosophy, expresses great unhappiness with this phrase and tries to retranslate it. He tries to translate it to say, it is the way with God in the world that there should be the state. And he clearly attributes the phrase more to Gans than to Hegel. In fact, Gans took the phrase from a transcript of an 1824-25 lecture of Hegel's presented by someone called Griesheim, the full text of which finally became publicly available in 2015. And Gans's wording is entirely accurate and comes from a passage that begins, "The state in and of itself is the moral whole, the realization of freedom. It is the absolute purpose of reason that freedom be real." The passage concludes against Kaufmann's attempt to soften it with these words: when considering the idea of the state, one must not have particular states in mind, nor particular institutions. One must consider the idea, this real God, die Idee, diesen wirklichen Gott, in itself. Hegel replicates through the philosophy of subjectivity that understanding of being which posits either God or the state as the highest being, the most beingful being that confers being on all other being. The identification of the political with the divine is nothing new, having its antecedent in Spinoza, but again with Aristotle in the background, who defines being itself at one point as theologia, long before Christianity or anything like it got hold of Aristotle's texts, and receives subsequent analyses under a multitude of other names and guises. One thinks only of the repeated attempts people like Gentile and Burley to think through totalitarianism as political religion, and more serious theoretical attempts, Durkheim might be an example and Feuerbach another, to understand the way in which a totemic value of the state occupies that place that metaphysics had ascribed to God. Of far more importance has been the unfolding political conceived in this way as the development of the subjectivity of the subject for bringing the thought of the political under the sway of the intersubjective. Now, in what follows, I could very easily show you, and Buber, but also Feuerbach is the best person to do so. Well, I'll just give you this quote. Feuerbach calls the distinction between the I and the thou, and the thou, therefore between two subjects, as the basic condition of all personality, all consciousness. And then Feuerbach says this: man in himself is man in the ordinary sense. Man with man, the unity of I and thou, is God. Now, I do not take God, because I don't think Feuerbach particularly believed in a personal God, and I do not take God here to be, in any sense, the Christian God, or a God in whom one might, as it were, believe through faith. The God in question is not a God of faith, but a God of reason, or rather it is reason as such. And there is a great deal that could be said about this. But one of the fundamental features of the unfolding of the political in the present situation, and this is where I want to leave off and just say one other thing in conclusion, is this constant attempt to reproduce a singular universal as a principle of reason. Some might call it God, others might call it reason as such. Kant calls it the Einbildungskraft, the power for the construction or making of images, which functions as the unity of the political, from out of which the political flows. And a lot of the research that I'm trying to do at the moment, especially with regard to the contemporary situation, is focused on exactly this. One of the reasons, as it were, for the mood of fury that accompanies so much modern political discourse is the determination to insist that your God or my principle of reason must be accepted by you as your God or your principle of reason. And the inability to unify these things, or the inability to show how they are unified in and of themselves. And this, by the way, is what Hegel means by the philosophy of history, and what Kant means by philosophy taken as a universal history with a cosmopolitan aim, is the reason, if you like, for the conflictual character of modern politics. So I want to end on this note only, and it's a very quick end. How would we understand anything other than this? The central thought in subjectivity is the construction not of the subject-object distinction, but of the reflection on the subject-object distinction, what Kant called reflexion and Hegel called the same. I leave you therefore with only this thought: what if, rather than posing the subject as that place within which the unity of anything like the political appears, history and time itself were those places, that place from which the unity of the political has to be taken off? This afternoon, Aaron sent to me, because he knows I've been looking for a quote in Martin Heidegger's work for some months, which I cannot find. It's an infuriating thing when you, those times when you read something and you think, I'll never forget that, and then you do. And this is what Heidegger said, I believe, around about 1931, which I think helps us, although it may need some discussion if we have time and if I haven't spoken too long. I'm looking at Aaron's face to see if he's how hard he's frowning. It is not humanity that matters, i.e. that notion of the cosmopolitan or the universal in history, but the being of what is present, what Heidegger calls Dasein, but he hyphenates it. And this because there is being itself. By being, Heidegger means not the unity of all it is that there is, but the constant unifying of what there is. And Heidegger goes on to say, and this in the uncanny situation where it does not have to be wrested from a depth and darkness, but where conversely the path to ground what he means by that principle of reason, or what has often been named as God, is to be taken through the knowledge of what is to come rather than what has been. Is such a thing even possible? It is necessary, and this path is the action of concealment and silence. So I'll leave it there and open. I hope we have time, Aaron, for some discussion.
Thank you very much, Laurence. I think we got to 1732 without a mention of Heidegger, so that's a big plus for us as a foundation. We have about 10 minutes for discussion and some questions. So while people are formulating theirs, I might ask about the nature of the unfolding itself, I suppose. In Hegel's sense, it's a development, right? It's an Entwicklung, a development toward the absolute subjectivity of the subject. And yet, this is where we've ended up, I suppose, taking Fukuyama's case concerning the end of history and the victory of liberal democracy. And, you know, you mentioned at the start that your paper wasn't designed to solve the modern problem of conflictual politics, but unfolding toward what? In your sense, unfolding, what is the unfolding political? What does it unfold toward, if toward anything? Or is it merely an unfolding?
The only way I think to think of this is to understand, for Hegel, time sort of works in reverse. And this is also true for Kant. Because there is already an image of what the world should be, as it were, but this is an ideal and rational image. This is what Hegel means by the real is rational and the rational is real. Therefore, and this is why everything is both compelled and has to be ethical, because it unfolds as that which we should do. And so therefore we're confronted by a should in everything that we do, what I call compulsion, the need. But this is what he means by the ethical. And it's absolutely clear that that's how it works for him. In other words, being, with a capital B, as it were, is prior to what is present. Kant calls this the Vorbild, the prior image of the way the world is to be taken, or the way the world is to be understood prior to any experience. This is what Kant means by the synthetic a priori. The a priori here operates in exactly that sense of God, or the principle of reason. It is that way in which we are compelled to know the world, such that when the world does turn up, we are in a sense already for it. There are some extraordinary statements by Kant in the First Critique, where he speaks of how, as it were, we await the way the world turns up, already prepared for it to do so. Hegel is even stronger, because he equates the absolute being with God, as it were. He reinstates that thought of God as directing the way the world should be, and therefore we construct the world as it should be. And there's a fundamental problem with this, as Nietzsche points out. If this God is not alive, if this Vorbild is not already universal, and it's almost impossible for Kant to ground how it could be possible. This is his problem with grounding the categories. Then how do we guarantee that the Vorbild, the prior image, the God, the principle of reason, is the same for every subject in every case? We can't. And yet we have to try to understand how to do so. If, on the other hand, we understand this the other way around, that is to say that we understand ourselves as derived off what already unfolds, so that the unfolding of the political would be the unfolding of the polis itself. And here I want to exploit the ambiguity between the polis as the people and the polis as the land, and the polis as the time, so that it is always the present from off which we are deriving ourselves and having to come to terms, then there is still a compulsion of a kind, but it's a compulsion to deal with the world as it actually is and not as it should be, which is what inevitably occurs in all formulations of subjectivity.
Thank you. Thank you. Thomas. Oh, you're muted, Thomas.
One day we'll get that right. Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this call. And my own background is analytic philosophy, so I feel very kind of heavy-footed in some of these conversations, and forgive my ignorance on it. So I think, Christian metaphysics has the advantage that there's a standard to which the state is accountable, and the identifying the state with the God of reason, which, if I understand it correctly, is what you're finding in Kant and Hegel. It seems to create, in theological terms, a kind of idolatry of the state. And I certainly think in terms of our real world political culture now, there is clearly there's a lot of contestation around the state, and the, if you like, ownership of the levers of power that the state has is the great prize of political conflict right now, which can have a kind of idolatrous expression. So I was wondering, is that a misinterpretation of the thinkers that you're describing? Are there resources in their work to explain why the actual state, that the institutional state that we see in our societies is in fact accountable to a higher standard? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I mean, all I could say is that it would be difficult. The French attempted to, but it would be difficult to worship the modern state, or difficult to love it in that way, as it were. And I think you put your finger on something that, for instance, those some of those commentators that I cited, like Bruno Gentile and also Michael Burley, have noted. I mean, they note this in relation to totalitarianism, but it also shows up in various forms of liberalism. The attempt, as it were, to reconstruct a divine principle behind the state. If I'm absolutely honest, I have a problem with that. I mean, that works very well in let's say, environments in which there is only one belief system. You think immediately of Christendom, or of certain conceptions of Islam, or indeed of ancient Israel, where one can very easily identify a religious principle with the structure of the state. The very thing that compels Kant in the first place to try to exhibit a finite understanding of a finite human understanding is the collapse of that possibility. I think that possibility is over. I mean, I mentioned Nietzsche, but Nietzsche is late onto the scene. I think people as early as Pascal, whom Hegel quotes, Hegel has these obscure references on the last couple of pages of the Phenomenology of Spirit to Pascal, to what he calls the Karfreitag of reason, the Good Friday of reason itself, points to the collapse of a principle in this way. And yet, a great number of even modern political movements, and you can see this among certain strands in contemporary reactions to political events now, are to reconstruct religiously based ideas, either of the state or of political theory. I have real problems with this. So, not least because I think they inevitably point to something that is partisan. I don't know if that answers your question. They must move in a one-sided direction, because we have no way of concurring among ourselves what this divine state should look like, not even on the basis of reason itself.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I suppose it was, the thought was, is there a standard of authority or judgment which stands behind the state, or is the state its kind of self-giving source of authority? But thank you, it's very helpful.
I think the way you pose the question exactly presents the problem.
I suppose you couldn't forget the historical context as well, could you? Especially with Kant and Hegel at the end of the beginning, or the end of the 18th century. The beginning of the 19th century, German unification isn't, it's 70 years away, 1871. So there is a genuine sense of historical destiny among the German states at the end when these two are writing, and this comes through in Hölderlin as well, which I don't think could be ignored in that question.
Well, and also this is what's often ignored in that. Is that German unification as a fact is 70 years away, but German unification in the Holy Roman Empire is not. And so it's the interrelationship between the Holy Roman Empire and Napoleon. These people often try to make a great deal out of Hegel's a bit given to flourishes, and he doesn't he say something about Napoleon, that in Napoleon we see history itself personified, as it were. He was a bit given to this kind of stuff. He says that Antigone is the greatest of all women ever to have lived, except that largely, as far as we know, Antigone is a creature of myth, but never mind.
Well, he went to meet Napoleon, so he probably just wanted to keep his head on his shoulders.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah, he did, didn't he? And isn't it? Wasn't it in seeing Napoleon that he
I think so.
Came from all these.
We are at 17:45 in the UK at least, so we've run out of time. But could we say thank you again to Laurence for his excellent paper? And we return again next week at 5 o'clock for John Marenbond's paper on conservatism and political philosophy. See you then.
Thank you, everybody. Bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.